He was a shepherd, and the world had shrunk to the size of his pasture. It was a small world, bounded by a crumbling stone wall to the south and the jagged teeth of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains to the north. His cottage was a squat thing of stone and sod, hunkered against the wind that swept down from the peaks. Inside, it smelled of lanolin, woodsmoke, and the damp, earthy scent of a life lived alone. Silas liked it that way. The quiet was a balm, a thick blanket over the sharp edges of memory. His days followed the rhythm of the sun and the needs of his sheep. Mornings were for letting the flock out, their bells a dull, clanking music in the thin air. Afternoons were for mending, fences, boots, the leaky thatch of his roof. Evenings were for sitting by the hearth, watching the flames eat the dry pine he'd spent the day splitting, feeling the silence settle back into his bones. It was a life of small, practical tasks, a life that asked nothing of him but endurance. He had endured. The storm came on the third night of the shearing. It was a brutal, black thing, a proper mountain squall that threw rain like handfuls of gravel against his small window panes. The wind howled a mournful song through the gaps in his stone walls, a sound he knew well. He'd thrown another log on the fire, the crackle and hiss a welcome counterpoint to the gale. His flock was safe, huddled in the lean-to he'd built against the eastern wall of the cottage. He was safe. That was all that mattered. Then he heard it. It was a sound that did not belong. Not the wind, not the rain, not the frightened bleating of a lamb. It was a grating, tearing sound, followed by a heavy thud against the outer wall of the sheep pen. Silas froze, his hand hovering over the warm mug of broth on the table. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. He knew the sounds of his land. He knew the cry of a hunting cat, the grunt of a wild boar. This was different. He took the iron poker from the hearth. It was heavy, solid, comforting. He moved to the door, his worn leather boots making no sound on the packed earth floor. He listened, his breath held tight in his chest. The storm raged, a chaotic symphony of natural violence. But beneath it, he heard something else. A low, ragged breathing, like a bellows with a hole in it. Against his better judgment, against every instinct for self-preservation he had honed over a decade of solitude, he lifted the heavy bar on his door and pulled it inward. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it back against the interior wall. Rain and freezing air flooded the small cottage, extinguishing the candle on his table and making the fire gutter and smoke. He stepped out into the maelstrom, the poker held tight in his fist. The rain plastered his thin wool shirt to his skin in an instant. He squinted into the churning dark, his lantern held high. Its flickering, oily light cut a weak swath through the night, and there, slumped against the low stone wall of the pen, was the source of the sound. An auk. His blood ran cold. The poker felt suddenly flimsy, a child's toy. It was a female, her massive frame folded in on itself. Her skin was the colour of mossy stone, and black hair was matted to her skull with rain and something darker. One of her tusks was broken, a jagged white shard against her grey lip. She wore piecemeal armor of leather and iron plate, all of it battered and scarred. A deep, ragged gash in her side wept a black river onto the muddy ground. But it was not her wounds or her sighs that held him paralyzed. It was the bundle she clutched to her chest, wrapped in layers of hide and fur. She held it with a ferocity that transcended her obvious exhaustion. Her body curled around it protectively, even in unconsciousness. Then his eyes caught a flicker of movement far down the pass. Torches, a line of them, bobbing and weaving through the storm, moving relentlessly upward toward his cottage, toward her. Hunted. Every rational thought screamed at him to go back inside, bar the door, and let the mountain's troubles stay on the mountain. Orcs were death. Orcs were the reason his world had shrunk to this patch of lonely earth. He could still see the flames, still smell the smoke from a raid 10 years gone that had taken everything but his own miserable life. He owed this creature nothing, less than nothing. He looked from the approaching torches to the orc. Her breathing was a death rattle. And the bundle in her arms, it was so small, so terribly, impossibly small. He saw not an orc, but a mother. He saw not a monster, but a creature at the end of its strength, making a final stand for its young. Damn it. The word was a bitter taste in his mouth. He lunged forward, grabbing her under the arms. She was heavier than a boulder, a dead weight of muscle and bone. He grunted, his boots slipping in the black sludge of the path. He hauled, dragging her backward, her broken body leaving a dark trail in the mud. He pulled her over the threshold of his cottage, the effort stealing the air from his lungs. He managed to get her inside and slam the door against the storm, dropping the bar back into place with a heavy, final thud. For a moment, he just stood there, panting, rain and sweat dripping into his eyes. The orc lay on his floor, a fallen monolith. The firelight flickered over her harsh features, the sharp line of her jaw, the grim set of her mouth. He had just invited the wolves into his pen. He had brought the storm inside. He was a fool. He took a deep, shuddering breath and moved to the fire, adding more wood until it blazed hot and bright. He needed light. He needed warmth. He needed to think. But thought was a luxury. The orc on his floor was dying. He knelt beside her, his shepherd's hands, so used to the delicate work of delivering lambs and setting broken bones, feeling clumsy and foreign. He gently touched the edge of her wound. Her skin was cold, too cold. He needed to stop the bleeding. As his fingers brushed the torn leather of her armor, her eyes snapped open. They were not the dull, glazed eyes of a dying animal. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a burning, golden light of pure hatred. Her hand shot out impossibly fast and locked around his wrist. Her grip was like an iron manacle. For a creature so close to death, the strength was terrifying. She could snap his arm. She could kill him right here on his own floor. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound more animal than person. Her lips peeled back from her teeth. Why? The word was a rasp, spoken in the broken, guttural cadence of common, taught by traders and mercenaries. Silas did not struggle. He did not speak. He simply met her gaze and held it. He let her see the exhaustion in his own eyes, the resignation. He wasn't a threat. He was just a man He had made a stupid choice. He used his free hand to point, not at her, but at the pot of water he had set to boil over the fire before the storm had fully hit. He pointed at the clean rags laid out on the hearthstone, the needle and gut he used for his own repairs. Her eyes followed his gesture. The suspicion in them did not lessen, but it was joined by a flicker of confusion. The pressure on his wrist eased, but only slightly. "What price?" she rasped, her voice a blade drawn across stone. He finally found his own voice. It was rough from disuse. "No price." She stared at him, her golden eyes searching his face for the lie, for the trap. She found none, only the weary honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose. Slowly, deliberately, she released his wrist, but her hand dropped to the hilt of a wicked-looking dagger tucked into her belt. The threat was clear. "Go ahead," she grunted, a gesture of permission that was also a dare. Silas nodded once. He moved with the slow, deliberate care of a man approaching a wounded wolf. He fetched the hot water, the rags, his needle. The process of cleaning the wound was a tense, silent ballet. She watched his every move, her body coiled like a spring. The gash was deep, a vicious slice that had cut through leather, mail, and deep into the muscle of her flank. It was crudely stitched, the work of a panicked hand, and had torn open again. He had to cut away the old stitches, clean out the filth of the road. Every touch made her flinch, a low growl vibrating in her chest, but she did not stop him. He worked by the flickering firelight, the only sounds the hiss of the flames, the howl of the wind, and her ragged breathing. As he worked, the bundle in her arms stirred. A tiny mewling sound escaped the wrappings. The orc's entire body went rigid. Her focus shifted from him to the child, a look of fierce, primal tenderness softening her brutal features for just a heartbeat. In that instant, all the fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a wave of pain and exhaustion. Her head fell back against the floorboards. Silas used the moment of distraction to pull the final stitch tight, knotting the gut with practiced efficiency. It was a rough job, a shepherd's mend, but it would hold. He covered the wound with a clean pad of moss he kept for such purposes and bound it tight with strips of cloth. He sat back on his heels, the work done. The orc's eyes were closed now, her breathing still shallow but more regular. The immediate danger had passed. He felt a wave of relief so profound it left him light-headed. He ladled some of the warm mutton broth from the pot into a wooden bowl and placed it on the floor beside her head, where she would see it when she woke. He didn't know if she would drink it. He didn't know if she would try to kill him in the morning. He only knew that he had done what he could. He retreated to his simple cot in the corner of the room, pulling his thin wool blanket up to his chin. He did not sleep. He lay there, listening to the storm and the breathing of the stranger on his floor, and wondered at the sheer magnitude of his own folly. The next days fell into a strange new rhythm, a rhythm of silence and suspicion. Gruner, he learned her name when she spoke it once in a fevered sleep, did not try to kill him, but she did not trust him either. She sat propped against the wall, the baby always in her arms or in a makeshift sling on her chest, and watched him. Her golden eyes followed his every movement as he went about his chores. When he brought her food, she would inspect it carefully before eating, as if checking for poison. When he tended her wound, her hand never strayed far from her dagger. He did not press her. He gave her space. He gave her food. He kept the fire hot. He spoke only when necessary, his words as sparse and practical as his life. More wood. The water is hot. Your wound looks clean. She would answer with a nod or a single guttural word. Yes. No. The baby was as quiet as its mother, a small, watchful creature with its mother's grey skin and a surprising fuzz of black hair. It rarely cried. Its eyes, wide and dark, seemed to absorb the quiet tension of the room. Silas found himself looking at it often. It was so fragile, a stark contrast to the brutal power of its mother. He had not been this close to a child since a long time ago. He pushed the thought away. Slowly, as the days turned into a week, a fragile thaw began. It was not in words, it was in actions. One morning, Silas woke to find his wood axe, which had been dull and chipped, leaning against the door. He picked it up. The edge had been honed to a razor sharpness, the balance reset. He looked at Gruna. She was nursing the child and did not meet his gaze, but he knew it was her work. She had used one of the flat hearthstones to sharpen it. Another day, he came in from checking the flock to find she had taken the scraps of leather he kept for mending harnesses and was weaving them into a new, stronger strap for his water skin. Her fingers, though large and calloused, moved with a surprising dexterity. She was contributing, claiming a small space in his world not as a patient, but as a resident. It was her way of paying a debt, he supposed, a way of maintaining her pride. The most significant moment came late one night. The storm had long passed, but the mountain air was cold. He had spent the evening reinforcing the pen, his muscles aching with a deep, weary cold. He had slumped into his chair by the fire, meaning only to rest for a moment, and had fallen into a heavy, exhausted sleep. He woke with a start hours later. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cottage was cold. But he was not. Someone had draped a heavy fur cloak over him. It was worn and smelled of pine, cold air, and orc. He looked across the small room. Gruna was sitting in the shadows, her back against the far wall. She was awake, watching the dying embers. The baby was asleep in a small cradle she had fashioned from an old apple crate and lined with fleece from a discarded sheepskin. She had covered him, an act of care given freely while he was vulnerable and unaware. He did not say anything. He simply pulled the cloak tighter around his shoulders and settled back into his chair, closing his eyes. But he did not sleep. He listened to the quiet breathing of the woman and her child, and for the first time since she had arrived, the silence in the cottage did not feel like a truce. It felt like a shared space. The first real conversation they had was about the dead. She had been watching him as he carved a piece of scrap wood. He did it sometimes in the evenings, a habit from a past life. His hands remembered the motions even when his mind tried to forget. He was carving a small, simple sheep. "For the child?" she asked. Her voice, though still rough, had lost some of its hostile edge. Silas shook his head, not looking up from his work. "No," He finished the curve of the sheep's back, the knife moving with a familiar grace. He ran his thumb over the smooth wood. It was for my daughter. He had not spoken that word aloud in 10 years. It felt strange on his tongue, a ghost of a sound. Gruner was silent for a long time. He could feel her eyes on him. She is gone. Yes. He placed the small wooden sheep on the mantel, next to another one, faded and worn with time. A fever, long ago. He did not say that the plague had come to their village on the heels of the orc raid, when the healers were all dead and the supplies all burned. The details did not matter. The loss was the thing. He expected her to say nothing or perhaps offer some gruff, empty condolence. Instead, she reached up and touched the jagged, broken edge of her left tusk. It was an old wound, the bone white and smooth. A challenge, she said, her voice low. For leadership of the clan. I lost. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Silas looked at her, at the pride that still burned in her eyes despite her wounds, her exile. He saw the warrior leader beneath the battered armor and the weary refugee. He understood that her loss was as profound as his own, just of a different kind. She had not just lost a fight. She had lost her home, her people, her place in the world. He nodded slowly. I am sorry. She met his gaze, and for the first time he saw not a warrior or a monster, but just a person who was tired and hurt and a long way from home. I am sorry for your daughter, she said, and he knew she meant it. The quiet that followed was different. It was not empty. It was filled with the unspoken understanding of shared grief. They were two broken people, sitting by a fire in a lonely cottage, keeping the dark at bay together. The peace, of course, could not last. The world was larger than his pasture, and it was coming for them. He found the first sign by the spring where he watered his flock. 2 sets of heavy boot prints in the soft mud by the water's edge. They were not his. They were deep, wide, and showed the unmistakable mark of iron-shod orc boots. He followed them for a short distance. They led from the direction of the pass, circled his property, and then headed back the way they had come. Scouts. His stomach tightened into a cold knot. He had known this was coming. He had just allowed himself to forget. He continued his circle of the property, his eyes scanning the trees, the ground, everything. On a large pine that marked the northern edge of his land, he found it. A carving, fresh and raw, cut deep into the bark. It was a symbol he did not recognize, but its meaning was clear. A stylized drawing of a tusk crossed with a hammer, a clan sigil, a marker. He did not run back to the cottage. He finished his chores, his movements automatic, his mind racing. He herded the sheep back into the pen, his familiar calls to them sounding hollow and strange in his own ears. He barred the gate. Only then did he walk back to the cottage, his face a grim mask. He entered without a word and went to the hearth. He took down the piece of bark he had cut from the tree and handed it to Gruner. She took it, her eyes scanning the carving. Her face, which had softened in the past weeks, hardened into a familiar mask of stone. The muscles in her jaw bunched. She traced the lines of the sigil with her finger. Grak, she said. The name was a curse. He sent them. They know you are here, Silas stated the obvious. They will be back. It was not a question. How many? She looked up at him, her golden eyes glinting in the firelight. The scouts were 2. They will send more, a handful, to test the defences, to take me. She paused, her gaze dropping to the sleeping child in her lap. To take my son. Silas looked around his small, simple home. The stone walls were thick, but they were not fortress walls. The door was heavy oak, but it would not stand against a determined assault. He had his poker, his wood axe, his carving knife, and his sling. He had not used the sling for anything but chasing off wolves in years, but his hand still remembered the feel of it. He was a shepherd, not a soldier. What do we do? He asked. Gruner looked at him, a strange expression on her face. A mix of surprise and something else he couldn't name. Perhaps she had expected him to tell her to leave, to throw her out to face her enemies alone. He had considered it. The thought was a cold, slimy thing in the back of his mind. But he had looked at the child, and at the woman who had covered him with her cloak, and he had pushed the thought away. Her fight was now his. He had dragged her into his home. He could not now cast her out. We fight, she said, her voice like iron breaking. They came 2 days later at dusk, just as she had predicted. There were 4 of them this time, moving out of the trees like grey shadows. They were large, clad in heavy furs and iron, carrying spiked clubs and crude swords. They did not try to be subtle. They walked directly toward the cottage, their arrogance a palpable thing. Silas stood in the doorway, his old shepherd's crook in his hand. It was made of ironwood, heavy and solid. He felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He was terrified. But he did not move. This was his home. He would not give it up without a fight. The lead orc, a brute with a scarred face and a sneer, stopped a few feet from him. He spat on the ground. We know the clanbreaker is in there, human, he snarled in broken common. Give her to us. Grak wants her. You can live. Lady, if I had tricks, I wouldn't live like this. The thought was a flicker of grim humour in the face of his own impending death. He said nothing. He just stood there, his knuckles white on the staff. Stubborn, the orc grunted and took a step forward. He is not alone. The voice came from behind Silas. Gruner stepped into the doorway beside him. She wore her battered armour cinched tight. In her hands she held his wood axe. She was still weak, her face pale beneath its grey hue, but she stood tall. The firelight behind her cast her in a fearsome silhouette. The 4 orcs took an involuntary step back. They recognized her. She spoke to them in Orcish, a torrent of harsh, commanding words. Silas did not understand them, but he understood the tone. It was the voice of a leader, a commander. The 4 warriors shifted, their arrogance faltering. They glanced at each other. They had come for a wounded refugee, not a war chief. But the lead orc, the one called Scarface, shook his head. He answered her in the same tongue, his voice full of derision. He pointed at Silas with his club. You hide behind a human worm, he sneered. That was a mistake. Gruner's face contorted with rage. Before Silas could even react, she lunged forward. The fight was a blur of brutal, desperate motion. She was not at her full strength, but she was faster than them. The axe swung in a deadly arc, biting deep into the shoulder of the first orc. He screamed and went down. Scarface roared and charged at her. Silas reacted on pure instinct. He was not a warrior, but he knew his land. As the orc charged past him, Silas thrust his crook between the creature's legs. The orc went down hard, sprawling in the mud. Silas did not hesitate. He brought the heavy ironwood staff down on the back of the orc's head with all his strength. There was a sickening crack, and the orc lay still. 2 down, 2 to go. The remaining 2 orcs, seeing their leader fall, faltered. One turned to run. Silas was already moving. He scooped a smooth, heavy stone from the pile he kept by the door for his sling. He spun the sling once, twice, and let fly. The stone hit the fleeing orc in the back of the knee. The orc crumpled with a cry of pain. The last one stared in disbelief, his eyes wide with fear. He looked at Gruna, who was advancing on him, the bloody axe held ready. He looked at Silas, standing over the body of his leader with a shepherd's crook. He dropped his sword and ran, disappearing into the twilight. Silence descended, broken only by the groans of the wounded orc on the ground and their own ragged breathing. Silas looked at the body at his feet. He had killed a man, an orc, but a man nonetheless. He felt a wave of nausea. Gruna came to stand beside him. She looked at the dead orc, then at him. She reached out and touched his arm. Her touch was surprisingly gentle.
"You fight well," she said, "for a shepherd." Silas could only nod, his throat too tight for words. The quiet of his life was gone, shattered. The blood in the mud was real, the threat was real, and it was not over. The scout had escaped. He would bring the rest. The true storm was yet to come. They dragged the bodies away from the cottage and dealt with the wounded orc. It was a grim business. There was no victory in it, only a heavy sense of dread. The scout who had escaped would tell his master what had happened. He would tell them that the refugee was not a helpless victim, and that the shepherd was not a harmless bystander. Grack would not send a small party next time. He would come himself. They had a day, maybe 2. They used the time to prepare. Silas showed Gruna the weaknesses of his small holding, the part of the wall that could easily be climbed, the blind spot behind the lean-to. She, in turn, showed him how to use the terrain to their advantage, how to create choke points, how to think like a warrior. He spent hours with his sling, practicing, his arm rediscovering the old, familiar rhythm. He gathered piles of stones, placing them at strategic points around the cottage. Gruna sharpened every tool he owned that could be used as a weapon. His knives, his shears, even a broken scythe blade. There was a new intimacy between them, forged in the shared violence and the impending doom. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, their silences filled with strategy and a grim acceptance of their fate. The line between shepherd and warrior, human and orc, had blurred. They were just 2 people standing together against the tide. The night before the attack, as they sat by the fire, Gruna finally told him everything. It came out in a low, steady voice, devoid of emotion. She was Gruna, daughter of Korgul, the late chieftain of the Stone Tusk clan. She was his chosen heir. But Korgul's second in command, a powerful warrior named Grack, had coveted the title. When her father died, Grack had challenged her for leadership. According to their law, the challenge was his right. They fought. He was stronger, but she was faster. The fight was a stalemate,
but he had landed a cheap shot, breaking her tusk and leaving her wounded. Before another challenge could be issued, Grak invoked an older, crueler law, a law of union. He declared that she would be his mate, that their bloodlines would merge, and the clan would be united under his rule. It was a political move, a way to claim her legitimacy without having to defeat her. "I refused him," she said, her voice hard as flint. "I would not be a prize. I would not be a brood mare for a usurper." Her defiance had split the clan. Some supported her claim, her right to refuse. Others, fearing a civil war, backed Grak. And then she discovered she was with child, not Grak's. The father was a warrior loyal to her, who had died in a border skirmish months before the challenge. Grak had used the child as a weapon. He declared it a bastard, a stain on the clan's honor. He decreed that the child, if born, would be forfeit, a sacrifice to the old gods to cleanse the stain. And Gruno would be cast out, stripped of her name and rank. "He did not want to kill me," she said, a bitter smile touching her lips. "He wanted to break me, to erase me. But my loyalists helped me escape the night my son was born. They died to give me a head start." Silas listened, the pieces falling into place. The desperation of her flight, the ferocity of her protection. She was not just a refugee. She was a queen in exile, a mother fighting for her child's life against the laws of her own people. He felt a surge of anger on her behalf, a hot, protective rage that surprised him with its intensity. But beneath it, there was a cold sting of something else. Inadequacy. Betrayal. He had taken in a wounded traveller. He had shared his home, his food, his quiet life with her. He had started to feel a connection, a fragile bond he hadn't felt in a decade. But it was all based on a lie. Not her lie, but his own ignorance. She was not just Gruna. She was Gruna, blood heir of the Stone Tusk clan. He was just a shepherd, a speck of dust in the grand, violent tapestry of her life. He had thought they were equals, two broken survivors. But they were not. She was a fallen star, and he was just the dirt she had landed on. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice quiet. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of shame in her eyes. "Would you have helped me if you knew? A human shepherd helping an orc war chief. You would have been a fool." "I am a fool already," he said, the words tasting like ash. "I thought—" He trailed off, not knowing how to finish. "I thought you saw me. I thought this was real." She reached across the small space between them and placed her hand on his knee. "What you did for a wounded woman and her child, not for a blood heir. That is what matters. That is what I will remember." But he could not shake the feeling that he was a pawn in a game he did not understand. His small world was about to be burned to the ground for a cause that was not his, for a queen he did not know. The next morning, they came. It was not a small party. It was a war band. At least 20 of them, led by a massive orc who could only be Grak. He was a mountain of muscle and iron, with a braided beard and cold, intelligent eyes. They surrounded the cottage, their numbers a crushing weight. Grak stepped forward, his voice a booming roar that echoed off the mountains.
"Gruna,
Blood heir of the Stone Tusk clan, your defiance ends today. Cast out the bastard child and submit to the law of the clan. Your life will be spared.
The siege began. It was a nightmare of noise and violence. They threw rocks that smashed against his walls. They shot arrows that thudded into his door. Silas and Gruner fought from the windows, two desperate figures against an army. Silas's sling was a blur of motion. He was not aiming to kill, but to maim, to slow them down. A stone to a knee, a hand, a face. He was surprisingly effective. The orcs, expecting an easy fight, were caught off guard by the hailstorm of rocks coming from the shepherd's cottage. Gruner used the bow he kept for hunting, her shots precise and deadly. She took down two orcs who tried to scale the wall, but they were too many. They brought up a heavy log and began to batter the door. The heavy oak groaned and splintered. They threw torches onto the thatched roof. The dry straw caught instantly. Smoke began to fill the small cottage, thick and choking. His home was burning. Everything he had, the sum total of his small, quiet life, was turning to ash and smoke around him. The wooden sheep on the mantel, his daughter's last gift, curled and blackened in the heat. A sob of pure despair caught in his throat. The door burst inward with a crash. Orcs poured into the room, their faces savage in the firelight. Gruner met them with the axe, a whirlwind of desperate fury. She fought like a cornered lioness, protecting her cub. Silas used his staff, swinging it in wide arcs, trying to keep them back. But it was hopeless. They were being pushed back, step by step, into the corner of the burning room. Grak himself stepped through the broken doorway, a cruel smile on his face. He ignored Silas, dismissing him as nothing. He advanced on Gruner, who was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She held the baby, now screaming with fear, tight to her chest with one arm, the axe held in the other. "It is over, Gruner," Grak said, his voice calm. "You have fought well, but you have lost. Give me the child." He pointed at Silas, who was being held back by two of Grak's warriors. "Your human worm cannot help you now." Gruner was cornered. Her strength was failing. The fire was roaring, the roof groaning as it prepared to collapse. This was the end. Then she did something unexpected. She looked past Grak. Her gaze locked with Silas's. Her eyes were burning with a fire hotter than the flames that surrounded them. She shouted, her voice ringing out over the chaos, clear and strong. It was not a plea. It was a command, a declaration. "Shepherd!" Every orc in the room, including Grak, turned to look at him. "Silas!" she cried, using his name for the first time. "Stand with me, not behind me, with me. My hearth is your hearth. My son will know your name as father. My clan is your clan." It was a bonding oath, a public, formal declaration of union made in the heart of battle. It was an act of supreme defiance. She was not just choosing a mate. She was choosing a human, a nobody. She was spitting in the face of Grak, her clan, and 1,000 years of tradition. Grak stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief, which quickly curdled into apoplectic rage. The insult was absolute. She had chosen this thing over him, over the clan. But her words had another effect. Silas saw it in the eyes of some of the other warriors, the ones who had hesitated before, the ones who had served her father. They looked at Grak, his face twisted with wounded pride. They looked at Gruna, defiant and noble even in defeat. And they saw the difference between a leader who fought for power and a leader who fought for her child. Silas's world had narrowed to that single moment. His home was gone. His life was over. He had nothing left to lose. He looked at Gruna, her face bloody and determined. He looked at the screaming child in her arms. He saw not a queen, but the woman who had shared her cloak with him, the woman who had sharpened his axe, the woman whose grief mirrored his own. He had a choice. He could die here as a shepherd who had made a mistake, or he could die as the man who stood with her. He met her gaze, and in that instant, the chasm between their stations, their species, vanished. He saw her, and she saw him. He wrenched himself free from the grasp of the two orcs holding him, a surge of adrenaline giving him the strength. He stood tall, his chin lifted. "Then stand," he said, his voice clear and steady. He accepted. His acceptance, his defiance, was the spark that lit the powder keg. "As my mate," Gruna finished the oath, her voice ringing with triumph. Grak let out a roar of pure fury. "Kill them! Kill them all!" But it was too late. 3 of the older warriors, the ones who had served her father, suddenly turned on the orcs loyal to Grak. "For the true blood heir," one of them bellowed, and the cottage erupted into a chaotic civil war. In the confusion, one of the loyalists grabbed Silas's arm. "This way, now!" Gruna was already moving, her loyalists forming a protective circle around her. Silas followed, stumbling through the smoke and chaos. The loyalist led them not through the door, but to a section of the back wall that had crumbled in the fire. They scrambled through the opening and out into the night, just as the main beam of the roof collapsed with a deafening crash. They did not look back. They ran. They fled into the dark woods and up the winding mountain paths that only Silas knew. They left his home, his past, and his entire world to burn behind them. He was no longer a shepherd. He was the chosen mate of an orc queen, a fugitive with a death sentence on his head. His life of quiet solitude was over. A new, terrifying life had just begun. The journey was a blur of exhaustion and fear. They travelled for days, moving through the high, secret passes of the mountains, the paths Silas had once walked with his flock. Now he walked them as a refugee. Gruna's loyalists, there were only 4 of them who had survived, were grim and silent. They treated him with a grudging respect born of the battle, but he was still an outsider, a strange, soft-skinned creature their leader had inexplicably bound herself to. They finally reached their destination, a hidden valley, a secret enclave where the last remnants of the Stone Tusk clan loyal to Gruna's father had gathered. It was not a village, it was a camp. A collection of rough-hewn shelters and smoky fires, filled with the old, the young, and the wounded. It was a clan on the brink of extinction, and he was their queen's human mate. The prejudice was a thick, suffocating blanket. He was met with stares that ranged from open hostility to pitying contempt. They called him the human or skin pouch, their voices dripping with scorn. He was weak, he was small, he was not a warrior. He he was a shepherd.
In their eyes, Gruner's choice was not a defiant declaration of love, but a sign of her desperation, her madness. He did not try to win them over with words. He knew that was useless. He did not try to be a warrior. He knew he would fail. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He worked. He saw their meagre flock of mountain goats was sickly and poorly managed. He took them over. He cleaned their pens, treated their hoof rot, and led them to better pastures. He used his knowledge of herbs and plants, the quiet wisdom of his old life, to make a poultice that helped heal the infected wounds of their injured warriors. He saw their shelters were draughty and poorly built. He showed them how to mix clay and straw to chink the walls, how to build a proper chimney that drew the smoke out instead of filling the huts. He worked from sunrise to sunset, his hands always busy. He did not ask for thanks. He did not rise to their taunts. He simply endured. His quiet competence his only answer. He was building a new life, one small practical task at a time. Gruner was their undisputed leader. Her fight at the cottage, her escape, had become a legend. She was a symbol of their defiance. She spent her days in council, planning, strategizing, trying to find a way to rebuild their broken clan. She was a queen, carrying the weight of her people on her shoulders. But at night, she would come back to the small shelter they had been given. She would shed the armor and the title, and she would just be Gruner. She would sit by the fire with him, watching their son, who they had named Kale in honor of her father. In these quiet moments, the queen would vanish, and the woman he had met in the storm would return. He would rub the tension from her shoulders. She would mend the tears in his tunic. They rarely spoke of the future. They did not need to. They were building it together, in the quiet language of shared work and mutual support. Months passed. The camp grew stronger, more organized. New refugees, hearing the story of Gruner's defiance, trickled in from Grak's increasingly tyrannical rule. The flock of goats was healthy, the shelters were warm and dry. The people were still suspicious of Silas, but the open hostility had been replaced by a grudging acceptance. They saw his work. They saw that their queen leaned on his counsel. They saw that their future chieftain, the boy Kale, smiled when the human shepherd entered the room. One evening, Gruner was preparing for a council of war. They had received word that a neighboring clan, old allies of her father, were willing to meet with them. It was a crucial moment, a chance to forge an alliance that could turn the tide against Grak. She was dressed in the last remnants of her ceremonial armor, a breastplate of blackened steel, a pauldron engraved with the old sigil of the Stone Tusk clan. She was struggling with a difficult clasp on her shoulder guard, her fingers clumsy with the weight of her responsibility. Silas came to her. He did not speak. He simply stepped behind her and reached out. His calloused shepherd's hands, so often dismissed as weak and useless by her people, moved with a sure and steady grace. He fastened the clasp, his fingers brushing against the skin of her neck. The moment was a perfect echo of that first night in his cottage when he had tended her wound. The same proximity, the same quiet focus. But the tension, the fear, the mistrust, it was all gone. In its place was a deep, unshakable intimacy, a bond forged not in law or tradition, but in fire and loss and quiet acts of care.
She leaned her head back against his chest for a long moment, closing her eyes. A silent acknowledgement of everything they had been through, everything they had become. "They still do not understand," she murmured, her voice soft. "They see a human. They do not see the man who stood in his doorway with a stick against 4 warriors for a stranger." "They don't have to," Silas said, his voice a low rumble against her back. "You do. That is enough." She turned in his arms, her golden eyes meeting his. She was a queen, a warrior, a legend. But in his eyes, she was also the woman who had collapsed in the rain, clutching her child, a universe of defiance in her tired gaze. He had not been born a king or a warrior. He was a shepherd, a man of small things, of patience and endurance and quiet strength. He had thought that made him lesser, but she had shown him that those qualities were a foundation as strong as any mountain. He looked past her, to the cradle where their son slept. Kale, a child of 2 worlds, a symbol of an impossible union. He had lost a family to the hatred between their peoples, and now he had found a new one by defying it. He had not sought a new life, a grand purpose. He had sought only peace, only solitude. But life had other plans. It had sent a storm to his door, and in the heart of that storm he had found not an end, but a beginning. He had been chosen, and in choosing back he had found his true place, not hidden away in a quiet pasture, but here, standing beside a queen, his hand steady on her shoulder, ready for the wars to come.